And we are on. Hello and welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is Kubernetes SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. Today is December 14th. You know, the year went by in a blink. This is the last meeting of the year because we're going to cancel the next one. Next one is going to be in January. And we have a nice agenda for today. So I think we shall start with Mo. Yeah, and I will leave it to you.
Good. Do you mind opening the links?
All of them, right?
Yeah, go for it. So while you do that, so the context for the issue is, so we promoted API server identity to beta in 1.26. After that happened, during like writing the docs and stuff for this, there were some issues noted, which are tracked in, I think, the second tab that you opened. Oh no, actually, that's my PR. One of them is an issue. The issue is the one, yeah, this one right here from Tim. So one is the label key is not maybe the most best key we could have used, arguably. We also did not have the wiring of the code correct so that it would actually work for aggregated API servers. We just flat out had it in the wrong spot. So all of our tests passed because our tests were testing the Kube API server. And that was all great. And Andrew added a bunch of extra tests. So we were really confident that we had got a working feature, and technically it works for one specific component in its configuration. But also in the process of trying to fix it, the value that we associated with the key doesn't necessarily make sense in a general context, because it's like kube-API server or something like that. So that's confusing. And like during the PR to try to fix this, Andrew was like, hey, like, why is the GC still inside the kube API server? I have some vague reasons for why I want the GC in one spot or the other, but it really sort of comes down to the question of how do we want like RBAC for like aggregated API servers to be configured, as in what do they have access to and how does that get set up? And that leads into questions of like, what namespace do these things go in? What are the keys and values we use for this stuff? If they're dynamic, how does something like the source version migrator find the identities that it needs to find, etc.? Or maybe, just a general component wanting to know the identities that's supposed to be present. I think that's the open questions. Andrew, did I miss anything?
Nope, don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to bring this up and see what feedback folks have.
David, go ahead.
David, why don't you just go?
So yeah, I'll go easy stuff first. I think that in terms of the key value, which is currently API server, it would be fairly easy to say that cleanup is based on the presence of the label, and the value just decides which particular server it is. So if we want to allow some other API server to set a different value, I think we can actually be backwards compatible, even if we allow them to set another value. I guess I should pause with that claim first, because that seems like a worthwhile discussion to have. Does that sound reasonable?
So the garbage collector would change from looking for key equals value to like whatever the syntax is for key present.
Exists, I think, is what we called it.
Yeah, so okay, yeah, I could see that. So the whatever value we would pick for the Kube API server, we would keep, but maybe in the code that wouldn't actually be the default. It would actually be like something that the Kube API server is overriding to its string, but like the default might be like, I don't know, generic API server or something.
I think that would be plausible. So then moving up in difficulty, the permissions, I like the idea of describing a cluster role that will do what we want, if possible. But one thing I'm unsure of is whether we want to allow, or even perhaps recommend, that another API server use a different namespace to store their lease. And I think Daniel is likely to have a much stronger opinion here than I do, maybe Tim as well, where they would say, I don't want to grant access to, I don't remember what namespace we put it in. We put it in Cube System, but I don't want to grant access to that namespace, to leases in that namespace, to other people's API servers. And if that's something that you feel strongly about, then we're going to want to figure out where to tell people to create them.
I personally don't care, but I do suspect that if we let everybody write their leases to the same spot, I will eventually get complaints from some end user is hogging all the bandwidth and or all of the concurrency in the Cube System
Or
namespace for this.
Conclusions, right? Like you could, you would either have to be specific about the names, or they'd be allowed to modify Cube API server's lease, right?
I believe that we put in a big enough hash that there won't be any collisions.
There won't be any accidental collisions.
I mean, we put the hash in the name of the lease, right? So I don't think there will be any collisions at all.
Well, assuming, for example, you don't try to run 2 aggregated API servers on the same host, because that's totally reasonable and possible today, because why not? They're just pods or whatever.
Don't we? I thought the deal was we're requiring people to have different host names for a given component, right? Oh, you're saying 2 different kinds of aggregated API servers on the same host.
Yeah, 2 completely unrelated API servers being run by different people on the same.
Yeah, I agree. That's unintuitive, and we should, if we're going to support more than one kind of API server, we should pack that into the name of the lease so that you can't have that kind of collision.
Well, we can definitely recommend that. But in terms of permissions,
if we change our, like we're going to put this name in the label or the value of this label, right? So if we're going to put that on, then maybe we can change this to also go into the either the hash or the prefix of the name.
I'd be okay with that. And you're not worried about someone misusing their permission to modify leases to go and just start, I don't know, deleting Cube API server leases or updating them in such a way that it destroys the Cube API server lease.
I'm slightly worried about that. I think it's a more reasonable mistake to just overwhelm the concurrency in that priority level and starve out legitimate traffic. Right, like in theory, priority and fairness fixes this, but we probably shouldn't encourage people to make priority and fairness work hard.
Okay.
But yeah, I guess that means that the garbage collector is going to have to look in more than one place, like more than one namespace.
So that would be the option. If we wanted to have it work in more than one namespace, we could base that on label selection, which would not be as efficient as namespaces, but it would give you permission divisibility. Now, I'm okay without permission divisibility if that's okay with you, but
I guess
what it means.
How hard is it to add that after the fact if it turns out we're wrong?
Not
I think it's somewhat difficult because we would have
you wouldn't be able to control the rollout time frame, right? So imagine you discover you're wrong, you need a fix, you actually have to get individual projects to update, then bundle, release, then backport wherever you need to. Again, not impossible, but if you needed a fix, you couldn't get it quickly.
Yeah, that tells me if there's much risk of needing this, then we should probably segregate these leases from the beginning. And I think there's at least like a 5% chance that somebody will need this desperately.
Okay, then I think that gives us a direction on which way to go. Oh, Mo has a hand now.
I was gonna ask on the segregation bit, does it make the problem any better if we didn't use cube system? If we just made a namespace that was entire purpose for these identity leases, or are we still, is the concern that we want to guarantee that, like, for example, the Cube API server identity leases can't be mucked with by people we don't expect?
I don't
I think it's
for it now, but
all of the above, yeah.
5% chance that somebody does it, like, yeah, it could happen.
Okay, so we would make, what would the lease namespace be in the generic API server library code? Like, what would it try to use without configuration?
Perhaps to use this feature, they have to explicitly say with leases and pass you a namespace and the value that they want in their key.
Okay, I could buy that. That doesn't seem bad, mostly because, well, if you don't need it, then you don't need it. So whatever, like if you don't have storage in your aggregated API server, because that's totally valid to not. Okay, so you opt in, and the namespace you specify, you better have RBAC for it, because otherwise it's not going to work out so well.
Yeah, but I think a lot of other projects that, like the sort of project that is making an aggregated API server, is often already making some sort of, project name - system namespace. Like I'm aware of Istio system out in the wild and other various things like that. So I don't think that's too much of an ask.
Okay, but we would still keep the garbage collection in the Cube API server, but we would just make it multi namespace aware and keyed off of just the key, so that way it could garbage collect.
Yeah,
stuff.
when I was arguing that it should go into Cube API server, I hadn't thought that aggregated API servers would want the same thing. I think originally we had it in controller manager. I'm conflicted, I guess. It seems like controller manager is a more general place. However, it also seems like like API server should be able to like know who it is, without, like, if your controller manager is having a problem or not running or something. I don't know that we'd want that to impact API server knowing what each instance is called. So I guess I'd still vote for having that in API server. I don't know how David feels about that. I don't know. It's a little weird either way.
I think the most critical choice is how we identify it, which, if we agree on multiple namespaces and then we agree that for permissions, we're going to create a cluster role that somebody can bind into their namespace if they need to. Then I think that takes us to the next spot of, there was one of these issues opened by someone who said you have an unregistered name and it's not prefixed, right?
What if we just made everybody run a garbage collector for their specific set of identities? Then we don't have to solve the general problem of giving our garbage collector permission on their set of leases.
I'm okay with that. I don't feel strongly, really.
I mean, they've already got to set up some stuff.
Go ahead and set up the rest. That's fine. I mean, in the library, it could be moved, and it would be fairly easy for library consumers. And Mo would just be sitting there going, "Come on, guys."
No, it's fine. Like,
but that seems fine.
Yeah, it's not really any more or less work, because I'm not like writing a new controller. I'm moving code from one spot to the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this also like means that if some aggregated API server is doing a lot of churn in its leases for some reason, you're not stressing out the garbage collector in the main API server, which seems okay, I guess.
So do we have any concern about an aggregated API server that's behaving poorly and not garbage collecting, or gets like
They get what they
uninstalled and a
deserve.
bunch of sorry, dude, go ahead.
I think they get what they deserve. It would be hard to come up with a case where they were running and had explicitly disabled the garbage collection, and we should feel sorry for them. Because leases are namespace, so when they go and delete the whole thing, everything gets cleaned up anyway.
Yeah, I guess by moving it into a, like making it opt-in and then moving it into a per aggregated API server namespace makes it so that that you're much less likely to leave any garbage around because you're not using a shared namespace anymore. You're using your own, presumably you'll at least delete the namespace. Like you presumably at least delete the namespace and the API servers, and that should actually handle most of the stuff you could have done wrong. Okay. Let's see. We talked about the value. We talked about namespace. By having separated namespace, it makes the RBAC story much easier, which is just make a new cluster role and tell people to bind it. GC is pretty straightforward, especially if it's per actor now.
That leaves the key name itself. I don't know the issue, but there was a legitimate complaint, I think, about the issue.
Yeah, we basically did not follow best practice on the key name.
Yeah. And I feel kind of bad about that because I think I helped author the best practice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel bad about it because we should have looked at it more closely. Like we spent a lot of time discussing how to make leases be like really nice and good and like how we were going to hash things, but we forgot, I think, to like actually look at the value associated with the constant.
Yeah.
Yeah, oops.
Yeah.
So I'm inclined to try to fix this. Even though it is beta, I think this would be one where I would say over time we become backwards incompatible, and I just tell people I'm really sorry.
Yeah, I left the proposal like at the bottom of this issue on how we should go about changing it. Like I think the real concern is just the compatibility with the label. Like when you have a new API server that expects that's using a different constant, I think we just have to account for the fact that the new GC controller has to just look for leases with both selectors. And I think that should cover it.
Okay, and we'll do that until 128.
Yeah, 7 or 8, yeah. Whenever we're sure that there's no more API servers using the old label.
I think that ends up being 8.
Yeah, so this GC controller will actually at least transiently then live in like 2 separate places. Like it'll live in, or not necessarily live, but it'll be invoked in 2 separate places for the Kube API server. Once generically for like the new key and value, but once like explicitly with like the old key and value saying, no, you need to go find these and nuke them because nothing is updating them anymore, and we need you to sit there and do this.
Yeah, I don't think it hurts us too much to leave it in for an extra version or 2.
Right. Are we okay with something like internal Kubernetes component, or do we want to?
I think it's API server Kubernetes IO / identity component.
Yeah, that's something like that sounds much better than the word. Like I feel like the word identity and the word API server need to be in here somewhere.
Yeah, internal.api server.kubernetes.io/identity.
Yeah, I mean, I can propose something and y'all can bike shed at me all you want on wherever. That's fine. Okay.
I agree with getting the word identity in there somehow.
Okay. I think that covers everything, Andrew. Or how are you feeling? Do we have good next steps on this?
Yep, I think so.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, David and Daniel, for the discussion, and I think we can let Tim and Igor go for it for the next stuff. They're here.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Tim. Were you talking?
No, go ahead. Sorry, I was just late thinking, Mo.
Yeah, so we pushed a PR for a KEP yesterday. We've been doing a little back and forth on it. It's exclusion for webhooks again, except now it's on now we're following the pattern of validating admission policy and including it on the validating webhook configuration object. So basically we're allowing those to also have exclusion is the proposal, similar to how validating admission policy does. If you dig into the proposal or the POC code, we use actually the same rule object as the validating admission policy. And then we talked through some, we were talking about the validating admission policy as well. And we spoke to Joe, who was a primary author there, about how one modification we make is to the named rule with operation, which is that exclusion object. We're adding a namespace there. So validating admission policy will also get that, just to allow for more specificity for the user. So that kind of will help with one, anytime a user wants to be more specific with the holes they're poking in, kind of like maybe they have like a catch-all they want to poke some holes into. It'll help with that. It'll just make it more expressive and easy for a user to exclude things. And then the other benefit is we can use it with validating admission policies to kind of suggest, hey, like as a cluster operator, now I can suggest to a user, hey, this is probably stuff you want to exclude. And it's transparent to them.
Can you describe what additional power this gives you compared to the namespace selector and object selector we already have?
Yeah, so for example, with like the namespace selector, you may want to, it just allows you to be more specific, right? So you can tie the other selections like a specific resource name to that namespace, whereas in the global namespace selector is more global. So like you couldn't say, I want all pods in, I want to watch everything, including most pods in Cube System, except for if there's a pod in Cube System called core DNS, I want to ignore that one specifically, for example.
Yeah, I think in general, sorry to jump to queue. I think in general, what this lets you do, like exclusion rules make the wildcards useful because it may not be safe to use a wildcard for either you're getting a type that you don't want or a specific pod that you don't want or a specific type that you don't want. I think I said that twice. So an exclude rule lets you, the deal is when you want all things of some, meaning some rule except something else, like you don't want to be adding a list of names for every pod, right? You want to use star for the name and exclude the specific thing you don't want.
So the example that was just given for pods in a namespace, I think that could be achieved with a configuration that listed, I want to look at all namespaces using not in. So I could match namespaces with name not in Cube System.
I think the example given was actually you want to watch all pods in a specific namespace, except for a specific pod that you know it happens to be in that namespace.
So that would be the namespace selector of namespaces in that name, and then it would be the object selector. You're saying you have no way to label it.
So I personally, I think a better example is when you want to watch, like say you're a garbage collector or something like that, and you want to watch all resource types, including types you don't know about at the time when you're writing your webhook. But you know, for example, you don't want to watch leases. Today, there's no way to write that in our, right, there's no reasonable way to write that right now. I think that's a better example.
Okay, but that's an example in a different.
Yes, I don't know. It is a different spot. I don't know if we want to litigate exclusion rules on each aspect of this separately. Yeah, I don't know. I feel conflicted in that
I
it's
only
bad to
clicked
give
through
people
this
2 ways
earlier
to do
this
something,
morning
but
and
it's also
noticed there was-
bad to give people inconsistent ways to do things.
Yeah, so I clicked through this cap this morning, or just before this meeting, and I noticed there wasn't an alternative section that said this is the additional power that is granted here. I think those uses are going to be really useful, and I will finally let Tim go. He's been very, very patient.
Yeah, I was mostly just going to say what Daniel already said. I think the resources exclusion, like the resource types exclusion, so basically everything that's captured in that rule with operations type, is the very clear case of there's no way to do that today. Object names, we added the like virtual label for name. I don't know if that only applies to namespaces.
It only applies to namespaces, and any object name is usually something that the resource owner himself, like the person who's created the instance, they can just choose whatever name they want. So it's like an opt-in validation when you get down to that level.
Yeah. So from a security perspective, I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to exclude things based on labels. If we could scope that to a specific namespace, so say like only exclude things in this namespace that have this label, that might be more tolerable. But right now, the namespace selector and object selector are, it's a, let's see, if you're using a negative namespace selector and a negative object selector, it would be the union of things that match those, or the intersection, or I don't know what I'm trying to say there.
I was going to mention what I think Daniel just put in comments, which is that you can use the namespace selector to actually like restrict by namespace name. There's this subtle way you can do that, which helps a little bit.
Right, but I'm also drilling down on the like, what's the real use of a match on object name when you know that a user can choose whatever object name they desire, and so like it's like an opt-in. Do you want to opt in to having this admission plugin touch you, even if it's negative selection? We actually explicitly said that on the object selector when we built it, is that this can't be used for security. This is a user opts into being checked.
So the general form of your concern is like if you mention a specific object name, the user controls that, and they can control it in some random namespace, right? If it was just a specific namespace, then like there can only be one pot of that name, but across namespaces, it effectively gives people a way to get out of the policy.
Yeah, so, and then when I start comparing like how much value does negative matching on namespaces give you, well, you can already do that, right? You already have a not in.
Okay, so the one we agree that you can't do today is negative matching on type, correct?
Yeah, I don't think that's possible today.
Yeah, and that is a reasonable thing for people to want to do, I believe.
I haven't given it deep thought. I feel like it's come up once here before.
Yeah, it's come up several times before. I'm quite certain that it is reasonable for people to do this because, like, for example, our own garbage collector does something like this, watching everything except for events, right? There's more than events, but it watches everything except for a few things. So I think it's pretty reasonable for somebody to want to exclude some sort of high volume object that isn't actually important from a rule.
Even for stuff that you can do today, I think there's a lot of like cluster operation benefit to be able to explicitly list out your excludes and know that you're never going to hit those objects. So like if I was a cluster administrator and I was letting other people put in admission rules, I would feel a lot safer if we had already established a good set of exclusion rules that go on every webhook, and then I just made sure that they were always present.
Yeah. Let's see. We
There's
should
a
let
couple of
Mr. J.
hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the continuation of that and similar question. I came here because this is quite a common problem for Node becoming unreliable. Somebody has a bad webhook. And I was curious if this cap may help somehow to make it universal, to apply the same exclusion for every webhook. So I would like, maybe there is a webhook that checks all webhooks and like modifies them, adding this exclusion to everything, or perhaps some global rules that will apply to everything somehow. So
Yeah,
I want enforcement.
Yeah, now that we're introducing cell rules, and cell rules can't intercept webhooks, you could actually put a cell rule in that said like you must always have these exclusion rules set.
Yeah, in this case,
But-
it will be much easier to have exclusion rather than negative rules on selectors.
I guess I'm still interested in what additional power that is, right? Like I can write a label selector that says not in, and I'm not clear on, and this is where an example I think could really help, where is this additional power? Is this syntactic gravy? How much syntactic gravy is it?
It is, I think it is not additional power. The benefit is that you can mechanically modify the webhook configuration object to get this negative selection rule in a way that is difficult or impossible. If a user is already using the namespace selector feature and you want to modify it to make sure that they're not selecting certain things, you have to combine the cluster or platform admin's preferences with the end user's preferences, and that's difficult to do programmatically. But if you have this list of negative selection criteria, you can add those in programmatically.
So I think this is where an example would really help, right? When I think about it, because we've written one, right? And so mechanically, the way that you do it is you look at one and you say, I need to go to your namespace selector. If you have one already defined, I'm going to add a stanza because they're always ANDed. And my stanza is going to be select on this key with an operator that is not in with these values. And so adding it and forcing it is extremely easy. And if I'm mistaken,
Okay, maybe it's easier than I thought it is.
But like it was made to make this easy. Like that's why it's in the doc. Like Chow added it to the doc when he wrote this, because I said we need to make sure it does this. And...
Okay, let's go through the hands. Mo.
So, like two things. One, I think, I don't know if this helps or is it relevant. Then we added a label to like all namespaces, right? That includes like the name of the namespace as a label, so you can like select against them or something, right? We did that, right? That was a thing.
Yeah, there's some special label to help you use a namespace selector to detect the object's name, I think.
Yeah, I think we synthetically add a name label, which is the name.
Okay, I don't know if that helps here or if it's relevant. I was just thinking about it. The question I was trying to understand is like, so as a platform operator, is the expectation that I would, I don't know, wait for the cell admission policy stuff to make it to beta and then write a validation rule that basically enforces that you have my currently defined preference, which could change over time in there? And thus, if I change my mind later, I have to still write a controller or something to go in and update all the webhooks, at which point I would just write the controller and not bother with the cell admission policy to begin with.
Usually security people want these evaluated both at the front door and in an ongoing capacity. So yes, you'd have to do both. I mean, depending on what kind of guarantee you want and how often you change your mind.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess that's fine. But so I would have to be careful to make sure that my controller that goes and fixes my webhooks isn't getting broken by my customer's cell policy that can intercept my controller because it can intercept webhooks, which is really annoying in this particular case.
Yes.
Yeah, for us, it came up, say, for a QAPI server operator, which runs as a pod on the cluster, which runs in a namespace. And so if someone adds an admission webhook that stops the operator, which is managing your QAPI server, from being able to run, it's unable to report that it isn't running, right? Like that has been a challenge, but namespace selection as it exists today lets you say, this is the ones that are violating this rule. This is how you can fix them, and it's a fairly straightforward thing to add.
But David, what are you going to do when cell admission policy is there, and so they can break you in a new fancy way?
I will find a new fancy, it'll be an escalating battle. But like, that's why this, I'm interested in what the power is. So like, if it's not going to be object selection because a user can opt out of object selection, and it's not going to be namespace selection because we already have a mechanism for doing it, is it the negative matching on the types?
Sure. I think Tim, you can go. I think that's all I had.
I think Igor was next on the list. I feel like Zoom is changing the order on me. Igor, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe I don't understand namespace selectors fully, but I think a good example, at least with my understanding, is like, say I want to just capture all things everywhere, just asterisk, 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 asterisk. And I don't want to exclude, for example, Cube System from all those things. I only want to exclude maybe leases if they're in Cube System. Maybe leases that are in Cube System of a certain name. How would I do that today with just the namespace selector?
So when you made your webhook configuration, you can make one for leases, and you can make another entry for the other types you want to watch. And the one for leases, you would put a namespace selector on.
Sure.
Right. So
okay.
I'm not saying that, like, I'm not saying there's no syntactic sugar here, right? But separating out what is syntactic sugar versus what can you actually not do,
sure.
I think is useful to explain here. Because we are looking at fields that are going to be, I won't say conflicting. We're gonna have fields. If we do this, we're going to have fields that are interacting with existing fields in a different level in this type, right?
Sure, sure.
Joe.
There was also a issue opened by DIMS and some code where I think EKS had thrown over the wall a PR to add an ability to have excludes on webhooks written into the API server's like configuration that loads on startup, and then you wouldn't even see those configurations at runtime. So there was kind of like a management plane desire to have like some really hard fixed control over this at that level. I was curious if we're going to entertain that at all, or if we're more interested in a solution like this. Or...
Joe, I believe that we talked about this in a meeting 1 or 2 meetings ago, and
okay.
I think the KEP that we're looking at is a follow-up to that.
Awesome. Okay.
Basically, we said no.
No to that. Yeah, let's look at something else. Great. Okay.
Let's get it in the thing so people can see what's going on.
Awesome. Okay, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah. Tim.
Yeah, a couple different points I want to address. To kind of follow up on Joe's point, I am interested in exploring a way to do this across webhooks, not necessarily compiled or not necessarily statically configured on the API server, but I think there's still some discussion to be had around that. I want to keep that totally separate from this KEP because I think regardless of what direction that goes in, this has value on the specific webhooks. To David's questions around what power this adds. Yeah, I'm not convinced that the namespace and name selection on the exclude rules adds anything beyond syntactic sugar with what we have today. I'm not sure about name itself. I think I also have some doubts about how useful name would be in practice, because like if you want to exclude some specific pod that's like controlled by a deployment, that's not going to be particularly useful. I think definitely the resource exclusions is something that we don't have any way to do this today. I also want to ask, kind of going back to Sergey's point around nodes, if requesting user is something that we would entertain adding to the exclude, adding some sort of exclude rules around. So thinking specifically in the case of nodes, like, can I say that nodes are exempt from webhooks updating pod status? Because that's, we've seen things like that before, where a webhook prevents the cluster from being able to tell like what the current state is. I think that would be a case where you don't necessarily want to exempt all pod status updates from your, label security webhook or whatever, but the node should always be able to update pod status.
I didn't just miss it here. This did not talk about trying to use the subject, right?
No, I'm talking about adding that to this cap, or a separate cap.
Mo, you have your hand up again?
I'm trying to remember what my question was. Let's see. I on the thing that Tim just said, I was interested in that idea, though. I guess, have folks thought about having better support for things that like can't be impersonated effectively? Like, anytime you have any exclusion based on identity, then I have to ask you how you plan on defending it from the cluster admin, which is the persona we hand out to people in our managed environments effectively.
I think that's a great question, but it might be pretty significant scope creep for this for this conversation so far.
Yeah, totally. I can't remember what the other thing was on my mind, so if I remember, I'll raise my hand. So.
Okay. Joe, is that a stale hand, or do you want to?
I'll clear that. Sorry.
Oh, perfect. Okay. What are the next steps on this cap? I think I hadn't seen it until this meeting started because these were some late added agenda items. So I think I definitely need to read it. I'm not sure if we have an action item other than that right now. David, do you have an action item? More examples, maybe?
I really would like to see what is power versus syntactic sugar. And not just because I want to say no to everything that is syntactic sugar. It's because looking at it and assessing power versus adding fields here, they're going to be additional selection at another level that we haven't had before, and that are going to have to coexist with the fields that we already have. I think there is a higher bar for considering what we should do with those. The use of subject, I'm somewhat interested in, especially if we wanted to have it at the same level as a peer to whatever this is already adding already. I think I'm probably against trying to figure out which fields have been modified and listing those as a filter, right? Because so pod status touches a lot of fields. I don't think I would go as far as to say like let's explore adding it so that if you modify a condition, we'll allow it, but if you modify the image SHA is being used, we will not. I don't think I want to go that far. Just thinking through next logical steps. I think that's it for me.
David, that last thing that you mentioned reminded me of the authorization webhook KEP that's still outstanding, which adds the ability to essentially pre-filter requests using cell rules, which would be an interesting kind of extension to consider for admission webhooks. I'm not sure that we want to necessarily block this effort on something like that, but the ability to say, like, before you even send, before I even do my advanced webhook logic, let me see if this request is relevant to it at all in the first place.
That's where my head was traveling as I was talking. What I'm concerned about is the review for the API for validating cell admission was very, well, at least very challenging for me to read through and try to think of the repercussions for and where something can go wrong. I think based on comments, it was also challenging for Daniel to review and perhaps for Joe to write. I wouldn't encourage you to add it to this KEP, and I'm not confident that we would be happy with it if we tried to add it.
All right, I tried to document that in the AIs, so if I missed one, please add it. And with that, we've got about 10 minutes left. Mo, do you want to talk about the last agenda item?
Sure, I can. I think this one's pretty quick. So it was an open issue, which is linked there, the fixes link, about we apparently, for I guess just because we create a new etcd client and connection every time you make a CRD, which is interesting choice of approach, I guess. And this fixes that to not happen, basically. And I did do it without adding a global cache because I am against global caches because they have caused me an exuberant amount of pain in LangO. So I don't want to add more to my life. But yeah, I wanted to get folks' opinion on if at a general level this was okay, and then if anyone would be interested in reviewing it. And I see, Steve, your hand is up if you want to say something.
Sure. I think my mic may be bad, but I remember there being one client per registry, not necessarily just CRDs. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the built-in resources end up being, but before, like if I run just a regular API server without this change from the head of master, it opens up 60 TCP connections to etcd approximately, with nothing happening on that API server. And then if you sit there, loop and create a bunch of CRDs, and then wait for them to be established and everything, and like just try to use them, and it just linearly scales up 1-to-1 with every CRD. And after this change, you have one, and that's it. It doesn't change. With an asterisk beside the one, because technically you can configure different etcds for different resources. So one or more, but fixed pretty statically.
So I'm in favor of not making a ton of etcd clients. Yeah, if you profile an API server, the etcd clients are one thing, but it also makes, like, each etcd client makes its own zap something or other logger, which takes up a ton of RAM. And really, do we need 50 of those in memory? Like, I don't think so. Yeah, I'm in favor of doing something like this. I haven't looked at this particular PR, but
I think the loggers got fixed already.
Yeah,
did they? Okay.
Yeah, we cheated with the loggers by just making it like a global field in the package and just using it. So, which by the way, this removes, because you don't need that anymore, because there's only one client, so like it doesn't matter anymore. Yeah, but yeah, is anybody interested in viewing this? The only thing I really have left, other than cleaning up the commits and maybe adding some code docs, is I'm going to try to come up with some kind of integration test that proves that you only have one client and thus stays that way. But yeah, otherwise the CI is green, and it's not that bad of a review.
I can offer to give it a pass. I've worked on the etcd client side before. So.
Great. You can tag me and I can give it a once over when you're done.
Okay.
All right. I think that's everything on the agenda.
It is, yes. So reminder, we are going to cancel next meeting. I hope everybody has time to rest and recover and celebrate with your loved ones these holidays. And we are going to meet again next year, January 11th. Okay. Thank you everybody for joining today and the good discussions. I will upload later in the day and post it in the channel. Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.